Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Reason. Observation of self-consciousness in its purity and in relation to external actuality, logical and psychological laws. Observation of nature finds the notion realized in inorganic nature, laws whose moments are things which at the same time have the character of abstractions. But this notion is not a simplicity that is reflected into itself. The life of organic nature, on the other hand, is only this intro-reflected simplicity, the antithesis within it of universal and individual, does not sunder itself in the essence of this life itself. The essence is not the genus which, in its undifferentiated element, would be self-sundered and self-moved, and at the same time would be for itself undifferentiated in its antithesis. Observation finds this free notion, whose universality contains, just as absolutely within it, developed individuality, only in the notion which itself exists as notion, that is, in self-consciousness. When observation now turns in upon itself and directs its attention to the notion existing as free notion, it finds to begin with the laws of thought. This individuality which thought is in its own self is the abstract movement of the negative, a movement wholly retracted into simplicity, and the laws are outside of reality. To say that they have no reality means in general nothing else than that they lack truth. They are indeed not supposed to be the entire truth, but still formal truth. What is purely formal without any reality is a mere figment of thought, or pure abstraction without the internal division, which would be nothing else but the content. On the other hand, however, since they are laws of pure thought, and pure thought is intrinsically universal, and therefore a knowledge which immediately contains being, and therein all reality, these laws are absolute notions and are inseparably the essential principles both of form and of things. Since immanent self-moving universality is the sundered simple notion, the latter thus has in itself a content, and one which is all content, only not a sensuous being. It is a content which is neither in contradiction with the form, nor is separated at all from it. Rather, it is essentially the form itself, for the latter is nothing else but the universal dividing itself into its pure moments. But the way in this form or content presents itself to observation, qua observation, gives it the character of something found, something that is given, that is, a content that merely is. It becomes a quiescent being of relations, a multitude of detached necessities which, as in and for themselves a fixed content, are supposed to have truth in their determinateness, and thus are in fact withdrawn from the form. This absolute truth of fixed determinateness, or of a number of different laws, contradicts, however, the unity of self-consciousness or of thought and form in general. What is asserted to be a fixed law that is in itself constant can only be a moment of the unity which is reflected into itself, can only appear as a vanishing magnitude, but torn out of this context of movement in the course of considering them, and represented separately, it is not content that they lack, for they possess a definite content, but were the form which is their essence. In point of fact, these laws are not the truth of thought, not because they are supposed to be merely formal, and to possess no content, but rather for the opposite reason, namely that they are supposed in their determinateness, or just a content, from which form has been removed, to rank as something absolute. In their truth as vanishing moments in the unity of thought, they would have to be taken as a knowing, or as a movement of thought, but not as a law, not as laws of being. But observing is not knowing itself, and is ignorant of it. It converts its own nature into the form of being, that is, it grasps its negativity only as laws of knowing. It is sufficient here to have pointed out the invalidity of the so-called laws of thought from the general nature of the case. The more precise development belongs to speculative philosophy, in which they show themselves to be what they are in truth, namely, single vanishing moments whose truth is only the whole movement of thought knowing itself. This negative unity of thought is for itself, or rather it is being for its own self, the principle of individuality, and in its actuality is active consciousness. Consequently, the observing consciousness will, by the nature of the case, be led towards this as the actuality of those laws. Since this connection is not explicit for the observing consciousness, it supposes that thought in its laws remains over on one side, and that on the other side it obtains another being in what is now an object for it, namely the active consciousness, which is for itself in such a way that it supersedes otherness, and in this intuition of itself as the negative, has its actuality. A new field thus opens up for observation in the behavior of consciousness in its actuality. Psychology contains the collection of laws in accordance with which spirit relates itself in various ways to the various modes of its actuality as an otherness already given. On the one hand, spirit receives these modes into itself, conforming to the habits, customs, and way of thinking already to hand, as being that in which it is an actuality or an object to itself, and on the other hand, spirit knows itself as spontaneously active in face of them, and in singling out from them something for itself, it follows its own inclinations and desires, making the object conform to it. In the first case, it behaves negatively towards itself as an individuality. In the second case, negatively towards itself as a universal being. According to the first aspect, independence gives to what is already there merely the form of self-conscious individuality as such, and as regards the content, remains within the general actuality already given. According to the second aspect, it gives the actuality at least a peculiar modification which does not contradict its essential content, or one even whereby the individual, qua particular actuality with the peculiar content, sets itself in opposition to the general actuality, an opposition which becomes wrongdoing or crime when it sets it aside, that actuality, in a merely individual manner, or when it does this in a general way, and thus for all, putting another world, another right, law, and customs in place of those already existing. Observational psychology, which in the first instance records its perceptions of the general modes coming to its notice in the active consciousness, comes across all sorts of faculties, inclinations, and passions, and since, while recounting the details of this collection, it cannot help recalling the unity of self-consciousness, it must at least go so far as to be astonished that such a contingent medley of heterogeneous beings can be together in the mind like things in a bag. I should say bag, not hag. More especially since they show themselves to be not dead, inert things, but restless movements. Observation, in recounting these various faculties, is keeping to the universal aspect. The unity of these manifold capacities is the opposite aspect to this universality, the actual individuality. However, to take up again in this way the distinctive actual individualities, and to recount that one man has more inclination for this, another for that one has more intelligence than another, all this is much less interesting even than enumerating the species of insects, mosses, etc. For these give observation the right to take them thus singly and uncomprehendingly, because they belong essentially to the element of contingent particularization. On the other hand, to take conscious individuality unintelligently as a manifestation that is single and separate involves a contradiction, since its essential nature is the universal of spirit, but since observation in apprehending it endows it with the form of universality, it finds its law, and seems now to have a rational aim, and to be engaged in a necessary activity. The moments constituting the content of the law are on the one hand the individuality itself, and on the other hand its universal inorganic nature, namely the given circumstances, situation, habits, customs, religion, and so on. From these, the specific individuality is to be comprehended. They embrace specific as well as universal elements, and are at the same time something given, something which provides material for observation, and which on the other hand expresses itself in the form of individuality. Now the law of this relation, of the two sides, would have to state the kind of effect and influence exerted on the individuality by these specific circumstances. But this individuality consists precisely both in being the universal, and hence directly and unresistingly coalescing with the given universal, the customs, habits, etc., and becoming conformed to them, and in setting itself in opposition to them, and in fact transforming them, and again in behaving towards them in its individuality with complete indifference, neither letting them exert an influence on it, nor being active against them. Therefore, what is to have an influence on the individuality, and what kind of influence it is to have, which really means the same thing, depends solely on the individuality itself. To say that by such and such as influence this individuality has become the specific individuality means nothing else than that it has been this all along, circumstances, situation, customs, etc., which on the one hand are shown as already there, and on the other hand as present in the specific individuality, express only the indeterminate nature of the individuality, which is not the point under consideration. If these circumstances, ways of thinking, customs in general, the state of the world, had not been, then of course the individual would not have become what he is. For all these elements present in this state of the world are this universal substance. The fact, however, that the state of the world has particularized itself in this particular individual, and it is such an individual that is to be comprehended, implies that it must also have particularized itself on its own account and have operated on an individual in the specific character which it has given itself. Only in this way would it have made itself into this specific individual that he is. If the constitution which the external world has spontaneously given itself is that which is manifest in the individuality, the latter would be comprehended from the former. We should have a double gallery of pictures, on one of which would be the reflection of the other, the gallery of external circumstances, which completely determine and circumscribe the individual, the other the same gallery translated into the form in which those circumstances are present in the conscious individual, the former the spherical surface, the latter the centre which represents that surface within it. But the spherical surface, the world of the individual, has at once an ambiguous meaning. It is the actual state of the world as it is in and for itself, and it is the world of the individual. It is the latter either insofar as the individual has merely coalesced with that world, has let it, just as it is, enter into him, behaving towards it as a merely formal consciousness, or on the other hand, it is the world of the individual, in the sense that the actual world as given has been transformed by the individual, since on account of this freedom, the actual world is capable of having this twofold meaning. The world of the individual is to be comprehended only from the individual himself, and the influence on the individual of the actual world, conceived as existing in and for itself, receives through the individual the absolutely opposite significance, namely that the individual either allows free play to the stream of the actual world flowing in upon it, or else breaks it off and transforms it. The result of this, however, is that the psychological necessity becomes an empty phrase, so empty that there exists the absolute possibility that what is supposed to have had this influence could just as well not have had it. Thus, there is no question of a being, which would be in and for itself, and was supposed to constitute one aspect, and the universal aspect at that, of a law. Individuality is what its world is. The world that is its own. Individuality is itself the cycle of its action in which it has exhibited itself as an actual world and as simply and solely the unity of the world as given and the world it has made, a unity whose sides do not fall apart, as in the conception of a psychological law, into a world that in itself is already given, and an individuality existing on its own account. Or, if those sides are thus considered each by itself, there exists no necessity and no law of their connection with one another. Calypso, from Homer's Odyssey. What is she thinking about?